C.K. Williams teaches in the writing program at Princeton. He's published 10 volumes of poetry since 1968. His collected poems will be published by Farrar Straus this November. He's translated Sophocles and Euripides, Zagayevsky, and Ponch. I spoke yesterday of his volume of critical essays, Poetry and Consciousness, 1998, from the University of Michigan Press. He won the Pulitzer Prize for Repair and the National Book Award for The Singing. And there are too many other awards, believe me, to list. Though I'm going to mention one award that he won in 1989 from the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters. And this is a prize that is named for a one-time member of the English department at this university, Morton Dowan Zabel. And Professor Zabel's bequest to the university is still helping us to sponsor poetry readings, including this one itself. There's a short poem of C.K.'s called Devout in his most recent book of poems, The Singing. It's a poem that I especially like. It's part of a series. And this poem is about one's inability to accept religious worship without willfulness and self-consciousness. C.K.'s poems are deeply secular, but they repeatedly reckon the differences between a religious and a secular approach to life. To a religious sensibility, there are obvious and deep reasons why atrocities are atrocious and pleasures are meaningful. To a secular sensibility, reasons must instead be found for atrocities and pleasures, or else foregone. C.K.'s poems often explicate the reasons that adhere to particular familiar experiences. But behind them is a horror of a blank, an inadequate reason or an error. This, I think, is the contemporaneity of C.K.'s work, its claim on a recognizable present. I'm thinking in particular of a poem from Repair called The Blow. Against this sense of something failed or missing, one more good reason behind our lives, is the periodic surprise of something beautiful or wonderful, something that comes in the clear, plain garb of an idiom that might cross your own lips or be read in a letter from a thoughtful friend. C.K.'s titles have gone from Lies in 1969 and I Am the Bitter Name, 1972, to The Singing. His is a body of work that is increasingly affirmative. C.K. wrote once of his envy of Yeats, who came to the height of his powers when the public experience of his compatriots was especially intense. That was a kind of break for Yeats, if he needed a break. Yeats was thereby very advantageously positioned to become the voice of his time. C.K. seems to be at the height of his own powers now when atrocity is on display in our own newspapers. The strength of his work may be not only the analysis of a poem such as War in The Singing, but also the refusal to let that subject have the whole ground of our own sense, of our own moment. Please join me in welcoming C.K. Williams.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's a little scary because last night I was out with some of the poetry people here and they were criticizing the way people read poetry. They were sort of really nastily criticizing it. So I don't quite know how I'm going to do this. Have you ever heard of silent poetry? The Singing. I was walking home down a hill near our house on a balmy afternoon under the blossoms of the pear trees that go flamboyantly mad here every spring with their burgeoning forth, when a young man turned in from a corner singing. No, it was more of a cadence shouting, most of which I couldn't catch. I thought because the young man was black, speaking black. It didn't matter. I could tell he was making his song up, which pleased me. He was nice-looking, husky, dressed in some style of big pants, obviously full of himself, hence his lyrical flowing over. We went along in the same direction, then he noticed me there beside him. And big, he shouted, sang, big. And I thought how droll to have my height incorporated in his song. So I smiled, but the face of the young man showed nothing. He looked, in fact, pointedly away, and his song changed. I'm not a nice person, he chanted. I'm not a nice person. No menace was meant, I gathered, no particular threat, but he did want to be certain I knew that if my smile implied I conceived of anything like concord between us, I should forget it. That's all. Nothing else happened. His song became indecipherable to me again. He arrived where he was going, a house where a girl in braids waited for him on the porch. That was all. No one saw, no one heard. All the unasked and unanswered questions were left where they were. It occurred to me to sing back, I'm not a nice person either, but I couldn't come up with a tune. Besides, I wouldn't have believed it, I wouldn't have meant it, nor he have believed it. Both of us knew just where we were in the duet we composed, the equations we made, the conventions to which we were condemned. Sometimes it feels, even when no one is there, that something, someone is watching and listening, someone to rectify, redo, remake. This time again, though, no one saw, no one heard, no one was there. This happened. This happens in a French lycée, which I'm sure everybody knows here is a French high school. A student, a young woman, in a fourth-floor hallway of her lycée, perched on the ledge of an open window, chatting with friends between classes. A teacher passes and chides her. Be careful, you might fall. Almost banteringly chides her. You might fall. And the young woman, 18, a girl really, though she wouldn't think that, as brilliant as she is, first in her class, and beautiful too, she's often told, smiles back and leans into the open window, which wouldn't even be open if it were winter. If it were winter, someone would have closed it. Close it. Leans into the window, farther, still smiling, farther and farther, though it takes less time than this, really an instant, and lets herself fall. A casual impulse, a fancy never thought of until now, hardly thought of even now. No, more than impulse or fancy, the girl knows what she's doing. The girl means something. The girl means to mean, because it occurs to her in that instant that beautiful or not, bright yes or no, she's not who she is. She's not the person she is. And the reason she suddenly knows is that there's been so much premeditation where she is, so much plotting and planning. There's hardly a person where she is, or if there is, it's not her, or not wholly her. It's a self inhabited, lived in by her. And seemingly, even as she thinks it, she knows what's been missing. Grace, not premeditation, but grace. A kind of being in the world spontaneously, with grace. Waitfully upon me was the world, waitfully this self which graced the world, yet never wholly itself. Waitfully this self which weighed upon me, the release from which is what I desire and what I achieve. And the girl remembers in this infinite instance, already so many times divided, the grief she'd felt once, hardly knowing she felt it, to merely inhabit herself. Yes, the girl falls, absurd to fall. Even the earth, with its compulsion to take unto itself all that falls, must know that falling is absurd. Yet the girl falling isn't myself. or she is myself, but a self I took of my own volition unto myself. Forever, with grace, this happened. So because I have my collected poems here, usually I try to read just new poems and things, but here I have all these poems that I could probably read for about 4 hours. I probably won't, so don't worry. But I'll read a bit from the past. The Neighbor. Her 5 horrid, deformed little dogs who incessantly yap on the roof under my window. Her cats, God knows how many, who must piss on her rugs, her landings a sickening reek. Her shadow once, fumbling the chain on her door, then the door slamming fearfully shut, only the barking and the music, jazz, filtering as it does day and night into the hall. The time it was Chris Connor singing Lush Life, how it brought back my college sweetheart, my first real love, who, till I left her, played the same record and head on my shoulder, hand on my thigh, sang sweetly along of regrets and depletions she was too young for, as I was too young later to believe in her pain. It startled, then bored, then repelled me. My starting to fancy that she'd ended up in this fire trap in the village, that my neighbor was her. My thinking we'd meet, recognize one another, become friends, that I'd accomplish a penance. My seeing her, it wasn't her, at the mailbox, gray-yellow hair, army pants under a nightgown. Her turning away, hiding her ravaged face in her hands, muttering an inappropriate hi. Sometimes there are frightening goings-on in the stairwell, a man shouting, "Shut up," the dogs frantically snarling, claws scrabbling, then her voice, hoarse, harsh, hollow, almost only a tone, incoherent, a note, a squawk, bone on metal, metal gone molten, calling them back. Come back, darlings, come back, dear ones, my sweet angels, come back. Medea she was, next time I saw her, sorceress, tranced, ecstatic, stock still on the sidewalk, ragged coat hanging agape, passers-by flowing around her, her mouth torn suddenly open, as though in a scream, silently though, as though only in her brain or breast had it erupted, a cry so pure, practiced, detached, it had no need of a voice or could no longer bear one. These invisible links that allure, these transfigurations even of anguish that hold us. The girl, my old love, the last lost time I saw her when she came to find me at a party, her drunkenly stumbling, falling, sprawling, skirt hiked, eyes veined red, swollen with tears, her shame, her dishonor, my ignorant, arrogant coarseness, my secret pride, my turning away. Still life on a rooftop, dead trees and barrels, a bench broken, dogs, excrement, sky. What pathways through pain, what junctures of vulnerability, what crossings and counterings. Too many lives in our lives already, too many chances for sorrow, too many unaccounted for pasts. Behold me, the God of frenzied, inexhaustible love says, rising in bloody splendor. Behold me. Her making her way down the littered vestibule stairs, one agonized step at a time. My holding the door, her crossing the fragmented tiles, faltering at the step to the street, droning, not looking at me. Can you help me? Taking my arm, leaning lightly against me. Her wavering step into the world, her whispering, thanks, love, lightly, lightly against me. This is a poem I don't usually, I'm not talking much between the poems, am I? Sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. I have no idea why that happens. Maybe sometimes I just feel more funny. This is a poem I don't usually read, and when I started thinking this morning of reading, for some reason I wanted to read it. I don't think it has anything to do with Chicago, actually. It's called Dominion Depression. It doesn't, I promise. I don't know what day or year of their secret cycle this blazing golden afternoon might be, but out in the field in a shrub, hundreds of pairs of locusts are locked in a slow sexual seizure. Hardly more animate than the few leaves they haven't devoured, they seethe like a single being, limbs, antennae, and wings, all tangled together as intricately as a layer of neurons. Always the neat, tight, gazeless helmet, the exoskeleton burnished like half-hardened glue. Always the abdomen twitched deftly under or aside, the skilled rider, the skillfully ridden. One male, though, has somehow severed a leg. It sways on the spike of a twig like a harp. He lunges after his female, tilts, falls. The mass horribly shudders, shifts, realigns. So dense, so hard, so immersed in their terrible need to endure, so unlike me, but like me. Why do they seem such a denial? Why do I feel if I plunged my hand in among them, I'd die? This must be what God thinks, beholding his ignorant, obstinate, libidinally maniacal offspring, wanting to stop them, to keep them from being so much an image of his impotence or his will. How divided he is from his creation. Even here, near the end, he sees moving towards him a smaller, sharper, still more gleaming something, extracting moist matter from a skull. No more now. He waits, fists full of that mute, oily, crackling, crystalline broil. Then he feels at last the cool wing beat of the innocent void, moving in again over the world. We'll hop back a little bit into my past. Excuse me here. Can't find things. The gas station. This has some bad words in it. So please forgive me in advance if anybody's offended. The gas station. This is before I'd read Nietzsche, before Kant or Kierkegaard, even before Whitman and Yeats. I don't think there were 3 words in my head yet. I knew perhaps that I should suffer. I can remember I almost cried for this or for that. Nothing special, nothing to speak of. Probably I was mad with grief for the loss of my childhood, but I wouldn't have known that. It's dawn, a gas station, Route 22. I remember exactly. Route 22 curved. There was a squat, striped concrete divider they'd put in after a plague of collisions. The gas station, Texaco, Esso, I don't know. They were just words anyway then, just what their sign said. I wouldn't have understood the first thing about monopoly or imperialist or oppression. It's dawn. It's so late. Even then, when I was never tired, I'm just holding on. Slumped on my friend's shoulder, I watch the relentless, wordless misery of the Route 22 sky that seems to be filming my face with the grainy oil I keep trying to rub off or in. Why are we here? Because one of my friends in the men's room over there has blue balls. He has to jerk off. I don't know what that means, blue balls, or why he has to do that. It must be important to have to stop here after this long night, but I don't ask. I'm just trying, I think, to keep my head as empty as I can for as long as I can. One of my other friends is asleep. He's so ugly, his mouth hanging slack and wet. Another, I'll never see this one again, stares from the window as though he were frightened. Here's what we've done. We were in Times Square. A pimp found us, corralled us, led us somewhere, down a dark street, another dark street, up dark stairs, dark hall, dark apartment, where his whore, his girl, or his wife, or his mother, for all I know, dragged herself from her sleep, propped herself on an elbow, gazed into the dark hall, and agreed for $2 each to take care of us. Take care of us. Some of the words that come through me now seem to stay, to hook in. My friend in the bathroom is taking so long, the filthy sky must be starting to lighten. It took me a long time, too, with the woman I mean. Did I mention that she, the woman, the whore, or the mother, was having her time and all she would deign do was to blow us? Did I say that? Deign, blow. What a joy the idea was in those days, though. Blown. What a thing to tell the next day. She only deigned, though, no more. She was like a machine. When I lift her back to me now, there's nothing there but that dark, curly head working, a machine, up and down. And now, Freud, Marx, fathers, tell me, what am I doing this, telling this on her, on myself, hammering it down, cementing it, sealing it in, but a machine too. Why am I doing this? I still haven't read Augustine. I don't understand Chomsky that well. Should I? My friend at last comes back. Maybe the right words were there all along. Complicity, wonder. How pure we were then, before Rimbaud, before Blake. Grace, love, take care of us, please. I'm going to take my jacket off. There's a sort of funny story I just realized that goes with that. I recently made acquaintance with Philip Roth. We come from the same town, Newark, New Jersey. And that home actually takes place about 6 blocks from where he lived. And we were meeting in a restaurant in the afternoon for coffee. And I had the poem to give him, and while I went to the restroom, I gave it to him. And I came back, and he's reading, and he said, blown! He said, blown! Ha ha ha! And there's everybody in the restaurant was turning around. I guess that's funny. Every time I read, I try to read at least one of my poems about global warming. These days I'm having trouble writing anything else. This is one from a few years ago. I thought of it reading it this week because of all these strange storms that are happening in the Midwest now, which some meteorologists believe may well be a result of global warming. Global warming is one of those things, the first time I heard about it, whenever it was like 30 years ago or 25 years ago, I thought, oh no. It was just this speculative little thing, and I thought, it's going to happen. It has to happen, and it's happening. It's called Night. Somehow a light plane coming in low at 3 a.m. to a local airstrip hits a complex of tones in its growl. So I hear, mingled with it, a peal of church bells, swelling in and out of audibility, a rhythmic but rich and insistent. Then, though I try to hold them, they dissolve, fade away. Only that monochrome drone bores on alone through the dark. This is one of our new winters, dry, windless, and warm, when even the lightest cover is stifling. A luxuriant flowering pear tree used to shelter the front of our house, but last August a storm took it, a bizarrely focused miniature tornado never before seen in this climate. And now the sky outside the window is raw, the inert air viscous and sour. I was ill, and by the merest chance happened to be watching as the tree fell. I saw the branches helplessly flail, the fork of the trunk with a great creak split, and the heavier half start down, catch on wires, and hang, lifting and subsiding in the last barbs of the gale, as though it didn't know yet it was dead. Then it did, and slipped slowly sideways onto its own debris in the gutter. When Ivan Karamazov is reciting his racking disquisition about the evils perpetrated on children, opining whether human salvation would be worth a single child's suffering, you know he's close to breaking down, sobbing in shame and remorse. And I wonder if he'd imagined our whole planet, the children with it, wagered in a mad gamble of world against wealth, what would he have done? What do I do? Fret mostly and brood and lie awake. Not to sleep wasn't always so punishing. Once, in a train stalled in mountains and snow, I was roused by the clank of a trainman's crowbar on the undercarriage of my car. I lifted the leathery shade, and across a moon-dazzled pine-fringed slope, a fox cut an arc. Everything else was pure light. I wanted it to last forever, but I was 20, and before I knew it, was back in my dream. Do I ever sleep that way now, innocent of everything beyond my ken? No, others are always with me, others I love with my life, yet I'll leave them scant evidence of my care and little trace of my good intentions, as little as the solacing shush the phantom limbs of our slain tree will leave on the night. Since we're in Russia with Ivan, I'll read a poem about Marina Tsvetaeva, the great Russian poet, who unfortunately is untranslatable. But her prose has been translated, and this poem refers to an essay of hers called Art in the Light of Conscience, which I think is probably the greatest single essay I've ever read on art and poetry and such things. I quote quite a bit from the poem, from the book in the poem. And so I'll say quote to be clear where she's speaking and where I am. It's called Marina. As I'm reading Tsvetaeva's essays, Art in the Light of Conscience, stunning, quote, art, a series of answers to which there are no questions, unquote. A tiny insect I don't recognize is making its way across my table. It has lovely transparent wings, but for some reason they drag behind as it treks the expanse of formica and descends into a crack. Quote, to each answer before it evaporates, our question, composed in Paris during the difficult years of exile. But which of her years were easy? This was at least before the husband, a spy and assassin, went back. Then she too, with her son, to the Soviet madhouse, back. Quote, this being outgalloped by answers is inspiration, unquote. Outgalloped. Still lugging its filigreed train, the insect emerges, fragile, distracted. It can't even trace a straight line, but it circumnavigates the table. Does it know it's back where it began? Still it perseveres, pushing courageously on, 1 inch, another. Quote, art, a kind of physical world of the spiritual, a spiritual world of the physical, almost flesh, unquote. One daughter dying at 3 of hunger, the other daughter, that gift of a sugar cube in her mouth, drenched with blood. Quote, A poet is an answer not to the blow, but a quivering of the air, unquote. The years of wandering, the weary return, husband betrayed, arrested, daughter in a camp, quote, the soul is our capacity for pain, unquote. When I breathe across it, the bug squats, quakes, finally flies. And couldn't she have fled again have been flown? Couldn't she, noose in her hand, have proclaimed, I am Tsvetaeva, and then not? No, no time now for then not, but, quote, above poet, more than poet, unquote. She'd already said it, already sung it, quote, air finished, firmament now, unquote. The last line is actually a line from one of her poems. I think I'll have a little change of tone here, perhaps. I'm sorry it takes so long. I can't find my way around yet in this book. Another poem with a dirty word in it. It's called Gas. Wouldn't it be nice, I think, when the blue-haired lady in the doctor's waiting room bends over the magazine table and farts just a little and violently blushes? Wouldn't it be nice if intestinal gas came embodied in visible clouds so she could see that her really quite inoffensive pop had only barely grazed my face before it drifted away? Besides, for this to have happened now is a nice coincidence because not an hour ago while we were on our walk, my dog was startled by a backfire and jumped straight up like a horse bucking. And that brought back to me the stable I worked on weekends when I was 12 and a splendid piebald stallion who, whenever he was mounted, would buck just like that, though more hugely, of course, enormous, gleaming, resplendent. And the woman, her face abashedly buried in her L now, reminded me I'd forgotten that not the least part of my awe consisted of the fact that with every jump he took, the horse would powerfully fart, flap, 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 something never mentioned in the dozens of books about horses and their riders I devoured in those days. All that savage grandeur, the steely glinting hooves, the eruptions driven from the creature's mighty innards, breath stopped, heart stopped, nostrils madly flared. I didn't know if I wanted to break him or be him. Now we'll come back to cities and such things. This poem is called Thirst. Here was my relation with the woman who lived all last autumn and winter, day and night, on a bench in the 103rd Street subway station until finally one day she vanished. We regarded each other, scrutinized one another, me shyly, obliquely, trying not to be furtive. She boldly, unblinkingly, even pugnaciously, wrathfully even, when her bottle was empty. I was frightened of her. I felt like a child. I was afraid some repressed part of myself would go out of control and I'd be forever entrapped in the shocking seethe of her stench. Not excrement merely, not merely surface and orifice going unwashed, rediffusion of rum. There was will in it, an intention, power and purpose, a social, ethical rage and rebellion. Despair too, though, sadness, loss. Sometimes I think I should take her home with me, bathe her, comfort her, dress her. She wouldn't have wanted me to, I would think. Instead, I'd step into my train. How rich, I would think, is the lexicon of our self-absolving, how enduring our bland, fatal assurance that reflection is righteousness being accomplished. The dance of our glances, the clash, pulling each other through our perceptual punctures, then holocaust, Holocaust, host on host of ill, injured presences, squandered, consumed. Her vigil somewhere, I know, continues. Her occupancy, her absolute faithful attendance, the dance of our glances, challenge, abdication, effacement, the perfume of our consternation. I'm going to read a few poems about our new life in war. The first one is called Shrapnel. It refers to a novel by Ian McEwan, quite wonderful novel called Atonement. I wrote the poem, I think, when I realized that we tend not, the word shrapnel has a sort of harmless thing. Someone was hit by shrapnel, and it's not harmless at all. And the other thing I realized is that we tend to forget, we have all this technical talk about war, that what war basically is tearing apart enough bodies so the other side stops. That's what war is. And we have all these euphemistic ways of speaking about it. So I wrote this. This also has a lot of quotes in it. Again, I'll do the quoting. Shrapnel. 700 tons per inch, I read, is the force in a bomb or shell in the microsecond after its detonation. And 2,000 feet per second is the speed at which the shrapnel, the materials with which the ordnance is packed, plus its burst steel casing, quote, stretched, thinned, and sharpened, unquote, by the tremendous heat and energy, is propelled outwards in an arc until they strike an object and either ricochet or become embedded in it. In the case of insufficiently resistant materials, the shards of shrapnel can cause, quote, significant damage, unquote. In human tissue, for instance, rupturing flesh and blood vessels and shattering and splintering bone. Should no essential organs be involved, the trauma may be termed, quote, superficial, unquote, as by the chief nurse, a nun, in Ian McEwan's Atonement, part of which takes place in a hospital receiving wounded from Dunkirk. It's what she says when a soldier cries, fuck, as her apprentice, the heroine, a young writer-to-be, probes a wound with her forceps to extract one of many jagged fragments of metal from a soldier's leg. Fuck was not to be countenanced back then. How dare you speak that way, scolds the imperious sister. Your injuries are superficial, so consider yourself lucky and show some courage worthy of your uniform. The man stays still after that, though, quote, he sweated and his knuckles turned white round the iron bedhead, unquote. Only 7 to go, the inexperienced nurse chirps, but the largest chunk, which she saved for last, resists. At one point it catches, protruding from the flesh. Quote, he bucked on the bed and hissed through his teeth, unquote. And not until her third resolute tug does the whole, quote, gory 4-inch stiletto of irregular steel, unquote, come clear. Quote, shrapnel throughout the body, unquote, is how a 10-year-old killed in a recent artillery offensive is described. Shrapnel throughout the body. The phrase is repeated along with the name of each deceased child in the bulletins released as propaganda by our adversaries at whose operatives the barrage was directed. There are photos as well. One shows a father rushing through the street, his face torn with a last frantic hope, his son in his arms, rag limp, chest and abdomen speckled with deep dark gashes and smears of blood. Propaganda's function, of course, is exaggeration. The facts are there, though. The child is there, or not there. As the shrapnel is no longer there in the leg of the shoulder. The girl holds it up for him to see. The man quips, run him under the tap, nurse. I'll take him home. Then, quote, he turned to the pillow and began to sob, unquote. Technically, I read what's been called shrapnel here would have once been defined as splinters or fragments. Shrapnel referred then only to a spherical shell named after its inventor, Lieutenant Henry Shrapnel. First used in 1804, it was, quote, guaranteed to cause heavy casualties, the best man killer the Army possessed, unquote. Shrapnel was later awarded a generous stipend in recognition of his contribution, quote, to the state of the art, unquote. Where was I? The nun, the nurse leaves the room, throws up. The fictional soldier, the real child. The father, what becomes of the father? He skids from the screen, from the page, from the mind. Shrapnel's device was superseded by higher-powered, more efficient projectiles, obsolete now in their turn. One war passes into the next. One wound is the next and the next. Something howls, something cries. I'll read another war poem while we're on it. I was giving a talk at someplace a few months ago, and I somehow came up, I was talking to the students and I was talking about how when you're young, you have great pleasure in being right. You will argue all night sometimes to prove that you're right about something. And I started speaking about how when you get older and you've seen what happens in the world, being right can sometimes not be a pleasure at all. And so I began to write and wrote a poem called Cassandra, Iraq. Cassandra, of course, was the character in Greek myth who, before Troy fell, prophesied that it was going to happen and wasn't believed. When she spoke, one of the myths says that when she spoke, people heard her speaking as though it was a bird singing. And so this is called Cassandra, Iraq. She's magnificent, as we imagine women must be, who foresee and foretell and are right and disdained. This is the difference between we who are like her in having been right and disdained, and we as we are. Because we, in our foreseeings, our having been right, are repulsive to ourselves, fat and immobile, like toads. Not toads in the garden, who after all are what they are, but toads in the tail of death and the desert of sludge. In this tale of lies, of treachery, of superfluous dead, were there ever so many who were right and disdained, with no notion of what to do next? If we were true seers, as prescient as she, as frenzied, we'd know what to do next. We'd twitter as she did, like birds. We'd warble, we'd trill. But what would it be, really, to twitter, to warble, to trill? Is it E, like having a child? Is it like a wound? Or is it inside, like a blow, silent to everyone but yourself? Yes, inside, I remember. Oh, it's where grief is just about to be spoken, but all at once can't be. Oh, when you no longer can think of what things like lies, like superfluous dead, so many might mean. Oh. Cassandra will be abducted at the end of her tale and die. Even she can't predict how. Stabbed, shot, blown to bits. Her abductor dies too, though, in a gush of gore, in a net. That we know. She foresaw that, in a gush of gore, in a net. This is a poem about poets, since there are so many poets hanging around the borders of Chicago. I thought I'd read it. It's called Saddening. Again, some quotes. Saddening. Saddening worse to read in frost at midnight Coleridge's ecstatic hymn to his newborn son Hartley, for whom he imagines, quote, all seasons shall be sweet, unquote, and to find in the biographies how depressingly their relationship deteriorated when the boy was grown. The father struggling between his dependence on opiates and the exertions of his recalcitrant genius, the son trying to separate from the mostly absent but still intimidating father. Their final contact as Hartley, a neophyte poet himself. He'll never attain stature, abandoning his father in the street, Coleridge in tears, not knowing as though he were a character in one of the more than minor tragedies he might have written if his life had evolved more fortuitously, how to begin to reconcile his unspoken suffering with his son's, how to conceive of healing the hurt both had to have felt before they reeled back to their respective isolations. The myth was already in effect then, Wordsworth's doing, that creativity like Coleridge's thrives best in seclusion. Even Coleridge, though his poem takes place with his son beside him and friends sleeping yards away, speaks of, quote, that solitude which suits abstruser meanings, unquote. So generations of writers go off to the woods to find alcohol, Schwartz, Lowry, too many others to mention, depression, or even Lowell, one hates to say it, wife abuse. Coleridge, in fact, was rarely out of some intimate situation for 5 minutes in his life, sharing his friends' houses and tables. And there's the scene, saddening too, worse, of the poet imploring the captain of the ship ferrying him home from Malta to administer an enema to unclog the impacted feces of his laudanum-induced constipation. Daily stuff for Coleridge. He hardly remarks it. Poor man, poor giant, excruciating for us, spoiled as we are, sanitized, tamed. But what does the life, dope, shit, neurosis, fathers or sons have to do with anything anyway? Think of innocent Claire, 28 years in insane asylums. And isn't there some fairness, you might think, some justice? But letting yourself think that, there's nowhere to go but bitterness, and how regret that deluge of masterpieces to rejoice in. Coleridge, anyway, at the end, found fulfillment, and Claire too, if not fulfillment, then something, perhaps acceptance, even Hartley too, something. I was there once, in that cottage, a packet of ill-lit rooms at the very spot beside the hearth where the poem was made, quote, the thin blue flame, the film which fluttered on the grate, unquote. You could still sense something in that comfortless cell resonating with youth and hope, which almost on his deathbed Coleridge wrote, quote, embracing, seen as one, we're love, unquote. Outside, the numinous sea, the hills, easy to understand, hoping to stay in such a world forever, and the qualm to tear yourself away. Thank you.